He gave water to a giant Apache woman. Next morning, 300 warriors surrounded his ranch. John had always loved the quiet of the desert. His ranch sat at the edge of wide rolling hills, where the sun rose over golden sands and the wind whispered through the dry grass. Life was simple, sometimes lonely, but he liked it that way. The mornings were always the same. He would rise before the sun, pull on his worn boots, and head outside to check on his cattle and water troughs. The smell of fresh dirt and hay filled the air, and for a moment he could forget the troubles of the world. That morning seemed no different at first. The sky was a pale blue, soft clouds drifting lazily, and the heat was just beginning to climb. John walked down the familiar path toward the small canyon near the edge of his property. The trough there was shallow and old, made of stone, but it had always kept his cattle hydrated through the hot summer months. As he neared it, he noticed something unusual. A shadow moving along the rocks. At first he thought it might be a stray animal, but then he saw a figure. It was a woman, and she was enormous, towering over most humans he had ever seen. Her clothes were simple, made of soft leather, and she carried herself with a quiet strength. Her skin was tanned and weathered, and her eyes were sharp, scanning the land as if she was looking for something important. She looked lost, exhausted, and thirsty. John froze for a moment, unsure what to do. He had grown up hearing stories about the Apache people who once roamed these lands, and he knew he needed to be careful, but fear quickly gave way to compassion when he saw her struggle. He called out softly, "Hey, ma'am, are you okay? Do you need some water?" The woman's eyes flicked toward him, and he could see the relief in them. She nodded slightly, her lips dry and cracked from the sun. Without thinking, John hurried to the trough, filled a bucket with water, and carried it to her. She knelt down, her hands strong and calloused, and drank deeply. John watched quietly, giving her space but ready to help if she needed anything else. When she had finished, John offered her some food, bread and dried meat he always kept for long rides. She accepted it with a quiet nod and ate slowly, as if savoring every bite. He noticed how careful she was, how she seemed to appreciate the smallest act of kindness. There was something in her presence that felt almost larger than life, yet gentle. John couldn't explain it. He felt both respect and curiosity at the same time. After a while, she stood and looked at him. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a message he somehow understood. She was grateful, and she meant no harm. John nodded, smiling, and gave a small wave. She turned and walked toward the hills, moving with a grace and power that made the earth seem smaller beneath her. He watched until she disappeared from view, feeling a mix of awe and unease. He had never seen anyone like her, and he knew this encounter would stay in his mind for a long time. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. John went about his chores mechanically, feeding the cattle, repairing a broken fence, and checking the water tanks. Every now and then he would glance toward the hills, half expecting the woman to return. But she never did. Wondered who she was, why she had come so far from anywhere, and whether he would see her again. Questions swirled in his mind, but he kept working, letting the routine of the ranch keep him calm. By midday, the sun was high and hot, and John decided to rest for a while under the shade of an old mesquite tree. He leaned back, feeling the warmth on his skin and listening to the wind rustle through the branches. His thoughts drifted back to the woman, and he realized he felt something he hadn't expected. Hope. Hope. That kindness mattered. That even in a harsh world, simple acts could make a difference. He smiled to himself, thinking how strange life could be, bringing someone so mysterious into his quiet, ordinary world. As the afternoon wore on, John returned to the main part of the ranch. He checked on the livestock again, mended a few fences, and made sure everything was secure for the evening. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows over the dusty ground. Birds sang softly in the distance, and the desert seemed to exhale after the heat of the day. John felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had faced something unusual today, something that could have frightened him, but instead, he had chosen kindness. That thought gave him a quiet satisfaction. Night came, and with it a cool breeze that swept across the ranch. John lit a small lantern and ate a simple dinner, thinking about the day. He could not stop thinking about the woman, how large she had seemed, how strong, yet how gentle in her actions. He thought about the stories his grandfather used to tell him, about the people who had once roamed this land with honor, courage, and deep respect for nature. Could she be one of their descendants, or someone entirely different? He did not know, and that was what made it so intriguing. Before going to bed, he stepped outside one last time, looking at the hills where the woman had disappeared. The stars were bright, and the desert stretched endlessly under the night sky. He felt a strange mix of excitement and unease, as if the world had shifted slightly, just enough that tomorrow might not be like today. But he also felt a deep sense of gratitude for the chance to help, for the encounter, and for the reminder that even small acts of kindness could touch someone's life in ways he could not imagine. Lying in bed, John replayed the day in his mind. He thought about the water, the food, and the silent communication between him and the woman. He realized that sometimes understanding someone did not require words. Actions could speak louder than language, and compassion could bridge worlds. Sleep eventually came, but the memory of the towering woman lingered like a shadow in his dreams. He dreamed of wide deserts, strong winds, and a presence that was powerful yet peaceful, watching over the land. As the first light of dawn crept into his small cabin, John woke with a sense of anticipation. Something told him that today would be different. He did not know why, but he felt that the encounter yesterday was not an accident. It was as if the desert itself had arranged the meeting, as if his small act of kindness had set something in motion he could not yet see. He rose quietly, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The air was cool and crisp, the desert alive with the sound of early birds and distant rustling. John filled the trough with fresh water, checked the fences again, and felt a quiet determination settle over him. Whatever today would bring, he knew he had acted with honesty and courage. That thought carried him through the morning, unaware of the incredible events that were about to unfold. John had spent the early hours of the morning tending to his ranch, as he always did. The sun was just beginning to climb over the hills, casting golden light over the dusty ground. Birds sang softly in the distance, and the gentle wind carried the scent of dry grass and earth. He felt a sense of peace and accomplishment after his usual morning chores. The memory of the towering woman from the day before lingered in his mind, a mix of awe and curiosity. He had seen something extraordinary, but the world around him had returned to its usual quiet rhythm, or so he thought. As he rounded the corner of the barn, checking the water trough once more, he noticed movement on the ridge above his ranch. At first he thought it might be a herd of deer or a group of cattle wandering closer than usual. But the shapes were too deliberate, too organized. Squinting against the morning sun, John's stomach sank. They were not animals. They were people. Hundreds of them. At first, he couldn't believe it. The figures spread across the ridge, their shapes distinct, their movements coordinated. As they stepped closer, he realized the unthinkable. It was 300 warriors, each dressed in traditional attire, moving with purpose and discipline. They carried spears, shields, and bows, their eyes fixed on him and his small ranch. The sight made John's heart race. He had lived alone on this land for years, and while he had occasionally crossed paths with travelers or neighbors, he had never faced something like this. Panic rose within him, but John forced himself to stay calm. He quickly retreated to the safety of the porch, scanning the area for anything that might help him understand what was happening. The warriors had surrounded his property, forming a wide circle that left no room for escape. He could see their faces now, strong, serious, and unwavering. There was no immediate attack, but the intensity in their gaze made it clear that they were not there for a casual visit. John tried to remember the stories his grandfather had told him about the Apache people, about their traditions, their honor, and the importance of respect. He knew that one wrong move, one careless gesture could provoke them. Yet he also remembered the towering woman from yesterday, the one he had given water and food. Could they be connected? Was this somehow related to her? The thought gave him a sliver of hope, but it did little to calm the fear that churned in his stomach. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to provoke any hostility. He fetched a few blankets, some bread, and water. Simple gestures of peace, something he had heard might be respected in such situations. As he carried them to the edge of the ranch, he waved cautiously, trying to show that he meant no harm. The warriors did not respond immediately. They remained still, silent as shadows, their eyes fixed on him. Every step John took felt measured, as if walking through a dream where every move had weight and consequence. Time seemed to stretch endlessly. The warriors did not attack, nor did they speak. John's mind raced with questions. Why had they come? Was he in danger? Was the towering woman somehow responsible for this gathering? The desert, which had always seemed so quiet and forgiving, now felt heavy and tense, charged with a power he could not control. He wished for guidance, for some sign that would tell him what was expected of him. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the wind shifted slightly, carrying a whisper of movement from the hills above. John's heart leapt as he recognized the silhouette of the towering woman. She stepped forward, her presence commanding yet calm. The warriors adjusted their stance, some lowering their weapons slightly, others bowing their heads in subtle acknowledgement. It became clear that she was a leader of some sort, a figure whose actions and gestures carried weight among the 300 warriors. John felt a strange mix of relief and awe. The fear that had gripped him was still there, but it was tempered by the realization that he was not entirely alone in facing this massive force. The woman's presence seemed to give him permission to remain calm, to act with dignity and respect. He took a deep breath and carefully placed the blankets, food, and water at the edge of the ranch, then stepped back, keeping his hands visible to show he had no weapons. He watched the warriors closely, trying to read their intentions. Some moved closer to inspect the offerings, while others simply observed, their expressions unreadable. The desert sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the land, and John realized that every action he took, every movement, was being studied. It was as if the world had narrowed to this moment, to this tense balance between fear and hope. John decided he had to speak, even if only to show respect. He raised his hand slowly and said, in a calm voice, "I mean no harm. I only offered water and food to someone who needed it. I hope this is acceptable." His words seemed small against the vastness of the gathering, but he hoped they conveyed sincerity. There was no immediate response, only the quiet rustle of wind and the soft creak of leather and wood as the warriors shifted. Minutes passed. The towering woman stepped forward again, moving gracefully among the warriors. She gestured toward John, then toward the offerings. Slowly, the tension in the air began to shift. John noticed that some of the warriors relaxed slightly, lowering their weapons and standing less rigidly. There was a rhythm to their movements, a silent communication that John could not fully understand, but he sensed that he was being judged not with anger, but with curiosity and caution. John's mind raced. He had always believed in kindness and in helping those in need, but he had never imagined that one small act, offering water and food, could lead to this extraordinary moment.
The desert had a way of testing people, he realized, and this was perhaps the greatest test of his life so far.
Every instinct told him to be careful, to move slowly, to remain calm. Every lesson from the past whispered that honor and respect might be the only way to survive this encounter. As the sun reached its peak, John noticed a change among the warriors. They were still serious, still alert, but their focus seemed divided. Some looked toward the hills as if expecting someone else, while others began to observe John with what he could only describe as cautious respect. He realized that their presence, their overwhelming numbers, might not be meant to harm him. Perhaps it was a test, a way to gauge the intentions of a stranger who had acted with honesty and compassion. John exhaled slowly, allowing himself a moment of relief. He knew the situation was far from resolved, but he also understood something important. Fear alone would not help him. He needed patience, respect, and a clear mind. He adjusted his posture, stood tall, and met the eyes of the towering woman once more. Her gaze was steady, unflinching, but not threatening. In that moment, John felt a strange connection, as if some unspoken understanding had passed between them. Hours seemed to blur as the desert heat rose and fell, but the presence of the warriors remained. John kept busy with small tasks, checking fences, adjusting water troughs, moving a few animals, but always with a watchful eye on the ridge. He could feel the weight of their gaze, but he also began to sense a rhythm in their behavior, a pattern that suggested he was being observed, not attacked. The silence, once terrifying, now held a strange promise. If he acted rightly, with honor and honesty, there might be a peaceful resolution. By late afternoon, John had begun to feel a cautious optimism. The warriors, though still numerous and imposing, seemed less like a threat and more like guardians of a world he had only glimpsed in stories. He thought of the towering woman, of her quiet dignity and strength, and realized that his life on this ranch, so ordinary in many ways, had intersected with something extraordinary. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but he knew that his actions, guided by compassion and respect, had brought him to this pivotal moment. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ranch, John reflected on the morning's events. He had faced fear on a scale he had never imagined, and yet he had survived without conflict, relying only on honesty and kindness. The desert, in all its vastness and mystery, had tested him, and he had met the test with courage. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he understood one essential truth. Sometimes bravery was not measured in weapons or strength, but in the simple choice to act with heart, even when the consequences were unknown. John had spent the entire morning and part of the afternoon watching the ridge. The 300 warriors remained, still and silent, surrounding his ranch like a living wall. He had done his best to remain calm, offering gestures of peace and respect, but the tension in the air never fully left him. Every movement of the warriors, every shift of their spears or the glance of an eye, reminded him of the power they held. He knew that one careless move could make everything go wrong, and yet he also understood that staying frozen in fear would not solve anything. By late afternoon, John realized he had to take action. He could not simply wait for whatever might come next. He needed to show that he meant no harm and that his intentions were genuine. Slowly, he gathered what little he had to offer: more blankets, some food, a jug of fresh water, and carried them to the edge of the ranch. His movements were deliberate, calm, and respectful. He kept his hands visible, hoping the warriors would understand that he posed no threat. When he reached the edge of the property, he stopped and looked toward the ridge. The towering woman from the day before stood slightly ahead of the warriors, as if leading them. Her gaze met his, calm yet commanding. He took a deep breath and raised his hands in a universal gesture of peace. "I only wish to show respect and offer help," he called softly, his voice steady despite the nervous tension in his chest. "I mean no harm. I have only tried to help someone who needed water and food." For a moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled through the trees and the warriors remained perfectly still, watching him carefully. John felt the sweat on his forehead and the heat of the sun on his back, but he did not move. He waited, understanding that patience was part of the test. Slowly, he noticed small changes in their posture. Some warriors lowered their weapons slightly. Others shifted their weight but remained alert, still observing him carefully. He realized that his actions were being judged, not ignored. The woman stepped forward, moving gracefully among the warriors. John could see the respect she commanded simply by her presence. Some of the warriors began to respond to her gestures, adjusting their stance and focusing on her movements. She raised a hand, signaling something he could not fully understand. It was clear, however, that her actions were deliberate and meaningful, that she was guiding the group without anger or aggression. John felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she would allow him to speak further. Perhaps this encounter could turn into something peaceful. He tried again, speaking slowly and clearly. "If I have done anything to offend you or your people, I apologize. I only wanted to help." He kept his voice calm, steady, and full of sincerity. Words seemed small in comparison to the overwhelming presence of the warriors, yet he hoped that honesty would shine through. The desert, vast and silent, seemed to pause around him. Even the wind held its breath, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves and the soft clatter of leather against wood. Minutes passed. John could feel the tension slowly easing, though he remained wary. The woman approached a little closer, stopping near the edge of the ranch. She looked at him carefully, then gestured toward the offerings he had placed earlier: blankets, food, and water. Slowly she nodded, as if acknowledging that he had acted with good intentions. John exhaled quietly, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. But he knew the situation was still delicate. 300 warriors were still watching, and the smallest mistake could change everything. Deciding to take another step, John lowered himself onto one knee, a gesture of respect he had learned from books and stories about the people who had once lived in this land. He looked toward the warriors and spoke softly. "I respect your traditions and your people. I hope we can find a way to understand each other." His voice carried the humility he felt deep in his heart, and he hoped the sincerity was visible. Slowly, one of the warriors stepped forward, separate from the rest of the group. He carried no weapons in his hands and walked with a calm confidence. John felt a surge of relief mixed with tension. This was the first sign that someone might be willing to communicate with him. The warrior stopped a short distance away, regarding John with steady eyes. It was clear that this was not an act of aggression, but an invitation, perhaps a test of courage, understanding, and honesty. The towering woman gestured for John to remain where he was. He stayed still, watching as the warrior studied him. He realized that his actions, his patience, and his respect were being measured, not by words, but by presence and behavior. The desert had always been a place of survival, but here it was teaching him something deeper, about honor, about human connection, and about courage. The warrior made a series of gestures, pointing first to John, then to the offerings, then toward the woman. John realized that he would need to respond in kind, through actions rather than words. He gestured with his hands, motioning toward the food and blankets, then bowed slightly in acknowledgement. The warrior observed him carefully, then nodded. Slowly, a bridge of understanding began to form, fragile but present. John felt a mix of hope and cautious relief. He could see the woman's eyes on him, calm yet watchful, and he understood that she was judging not only his actions but his heart. She seemed to recognize his sincerity, and in turn, the warriors began to relax slightly, though they remained alert. John realized that fear alone would not save him. Respect, patience, and honesty had created this moment of possibility. Hours passed as John continued to interact with the warrior and the woman. He offered gestures of peace, kept his movements slow and deliberate, and maintained eye contact when appropriate. The warriors observed quietly, sometimes shifting their stance but never attacking. John began to sense a rhythm to their behavior, a way in which they communicated silently among themselves. Every glance, every gesture held meaning, and he did his best to honor their traditions without knowing all the rules. By late afternoon, the tension had eased significantly. John could feel the presence of the warriors as less threatening and more deliberate, as if they were watching to understand rather than to harm. He realized that his courage had been tested in a way he had never imagined. Not with weapons, not with battles, but with honesty, patience, and respect. The towering woman, still standing slightly apart from the group, seemed satisfied. Her eyes held a quiet approval, as if she had seen the truth of John's character. John took a deep breath and allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. He had faced fear on a scale he had never imagined, and yet he had survived through calmness, respect, and understanding. The desert, vast and unforgiving, had not rejected him. Instead, it had offered a lesson. Courage was not always about fighting. Sometimes it was about choosing the right action, staying honest, and honoring the traditions of those around you. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in golden and orange hues, John felt a subtle shift in the warriors' behavior. They were still there, still numerous, but their stance was less rigid, less threatening. The woman stepped forward and gestured toward the horizon, then back to John. He understood that she was signaling a new phase in this encounter, a moment when communication could deepen and perhaps understanding could grow. Relief, hope, and cautious optimism filled him as he realized that his actions had created an opening for trust. John knew the evening would bring questions and challenges, but he felt ready. He had faced one of the most overwhelming moments of his life, and had survived not through fear or aggression, but through patience, respect, and honesty. The desert around him seemed to echo this lesson, vast and quiet yet full of hidden wisdom. He understood that this encounter would shape him in ways he could not yet imagine. The towering woman, the 300 warriors, and the silent strength of the land had taught him that true courage was as much about heart as it was about action. The sun was beginning to lower toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange, when John noticed a subtle change in the atmosphere. The 300 warriors who had surrounded his ranch since the morning no longer seemed as tense or aggressive. Their movements were slower, more deliberate, almost ceremonial. And the towering woman who had first appeared the day before stood at the center of their circle, commanding attention with her calm and powerful presence. John felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. After a full day of uncertainty, he sensed that something significant was about to happen. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to remain patient. For hours he had stayed careful, respectful, and honest, never making sudden movements or raising his voice. His gestures of peace, food, water, blankets, and bows of respect had clearly been noticed. Now it seemed that the warriors and the woman were ready to respond. The air was charged with silent expectation. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying only the faint rustle of leaves and the soft sounds of the desert evening. The towering woman stepped forward first, her movements fluid and commanding. John noticed how the warriors reacted to her every gesture. Some lowered their spears slightly, others shifted their stance, and a few bent at the waist in small gestures of acknowledgement. It was clear that she was a leader, and that her actions and words, though John could not yet understand them fully, guided the entire group. She raised her hands slowly, signaling for John to remain where he was. He did so standing tall yet careful, ready to show that he understood her authority. She began to gesture toward the ranch, then back to herself, then toward John. At first, he could not interpret her exact meaning, but he realized that she was trying to communicate, to explain something important. He observed her closely, noting the deliberate way she used her hands and body to convey ideas. Slowly, he began to understand. She was explaining that his actions yesterday, giving her water and food, had been noticed and appreciated. His courage, kindness, and respect had been recognized by her and by the warriors she led. A few of the warriors stepped closer, forming a path between John and the woman. Their movements were careful, deliberate, showing both caution and respect. John felt his heart race. This was an extraordinary moment. 300 warriors, fierce and disciplined, were now allowing him closer access, all because of a simple act of kindness. It was a lesson he would never forget, the idea that compassion could create trust, even in the most uncertain and potentially dangerous circumstances. The woman stopped a few steps from John and looked directly into his eyes. He felt a wave of calm wash over him, mixed with awe. There was no anger, no malice, only recognition. She slowly nodded, acknowledging that he had acted with honor. John responded in kind, bowing slightly to show his continued respect. He realized that this was a form of understanding that did not require words. In the desert, actions spoke louder than language, and honesty could be recognized without a single sentence being spoken. Then, the woman gestured toward the warriors. Slowly, they began to relax even more. Spears lowered, stances softened, and some warriors approached the offerings John had placed earlier. They inspected the blankets, the food, and the water, handling each item with care. It was clear that they were not here to punish him, but rather to observe, understand, and perhaps acknowledge his intentions. John watched carefully, making sure to remain respectful, understanding that this moment required patience and attentiveness. A silence settled over the desert, broken only by the soft wind and the occasional clatter of leather and wood. John felt as if time had slowed, each second stretching into eternity. He thought about the long hours he had spent standing, waiting, watching, and hoping that his actions had been enough. And now, slowly, it seemed that they had been. The towering woman whose presence had dominated the day stepped closer and placed her hand over her chest, a gesture John interpreted as a sign of gratitude. She then pointed toward John and made a series of gestures that he carefully tried to follow. She indicated that the warriors had not come to harm him, but rather to test him, to observe his character and see if he could act with honesty, patience, and courage. Every movement he had made, the careful placement of the offerings, the respectful gestures, the calm voice, had been recognized as honorable. The warrior's presence, once intimidating, was now a demonstration of respect and acknowledgement, a way of showing that John had passed a test he had not even known he was facing. John felt a deep sense of relief. The fear that had gripped him since the morning began to melt away, replaced by a profound understanding of what had taken place. The desert had tested him, as it often tested those who lived and worked on its vast, unforgiving land. But this test had been unusual. It was not a test of strength or skill, but of heart, patience, and respect. And he had succeeded, not through force or aggression, but through simple, human kindness. The woman continued to communicate through gestures, showing that the warriors now viewed John as someone they could trust. They no longer surrounded him with suspicion, but rather with acknowledgement. Some even stepped forward, bowing slightly in a gesture of respect. John could hardly believe it. 300 warriors, formidable and disciplined, had transformed from potential threat to a silent affirmation of his honor. He realized how rare and precious this moment was, and he felt gratitude for the extraordinary lesson the desert and its people had taught him. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ranch, the towering woman signaled that their gathering would soon end. She gestured toward the horizon, then back to John, indicating that the warriors would leave but that he had their respect. Slowly, the warriors began to retreat, moving with the same precision and discipline they had displayed all day. John watched them go, feeling a mixture of awe, relief, and curiosity. He had been surrounded by strength and power, yet had survived and earned respect through humility and compassion. When the last warrior disappeared over the ridge, John stood alone for a moment, taking in the quiet. The desert returned to its normal rhythm, the wind brushing through the grass, the distant call of birds, and the fading light of the sun. But everything felt different. He felt changed, as if the desert had opened a door into a world of understanding he had never known existed. The towering woman had left him with a lesson that he would carry for the rest of his life. Courage, respect, and kindness were forces more powerful than fear or aggression. John looked around his small ranch, feeling a renewed connection to the land, the animals, and the world around him. The day's events had shown him that even in moments of great danger, honesty and human compassion could create bridges where none seemed possible. He thought of the towering woman whose presence had guided the warriors, and he felt gratitude that he had encountered her. She had not only saved him from potential harm, but had also taught him the value of understanding and respect across cultures. As night fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, John returned to his cabin. He sat quietly by the window, reflecting on the extraordinary events of the day. He thought about how easily fear could have led to disaster, and how one act of kindness had changed everything. He realized that his life, once simple and predictable, had been touched by something profound. The towering woman and the warriors had reminded him that courage and compassion were inseparable, and that respect could open doors that force could never reach. Finally, John prepared for bed, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and peace. The desert outside was quiet, holding its secrets beneath the starlit sky, but within him, a sense of understanding and hope had grown. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he also knew that he had been tested and had emerged with lessons he would carry forever. The towering woman, the warriors, and the desert had all shown him that life could be unpredictable, dangerous, and yet full of opportunity for honor, compassion, and courage. John lay down, listening to the soft sounds of the night. The ranch, once a place of solitude and routine, now felt alive with possibilities. The extraordinary encounter had reminded him that the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward in ways he could not imagine. And as he drifted into sleep, he felt a quiet confidence, knowing that he had faced one of the greatest challenges of his life and had done so with respect, honesty, and courage. The desert had taught him well. The next morning, John woke to a quiet stillness on the ranch. The sun had just begun to rise over the hills, casting soft golden light across the dry grass and fences. For the first time since the extraordinary events of the previous day, he felt a sense of calm that was deeper than relief. It was hope. The towering woman and the 300 warriors were gone, but their presence lingered in the way the wind seemed to carry a quiet energy, as if the desert itself had acknowledged the courage and respect he had shown. John went about his morning chores with a renewed sense of purpose. He fed the cattle, checked the water troughs, and repaired a fence that had been loose for some time. But unlike other days, he was aware that he was not truly alone in the world. Even though the warriors had left, he felt a connection to them, and especially to the towering woman. She had taught him that understanding and respect could bridge gaps between very different people. He smiled as he poured water into the troughs, thinking how strange life could be, how one simple act of kindness could change everything. Over the following days, John noticed signs that the tribe had not forgotten him. Small tokens began appearing near the edge of his property: bundles of herbs, dried fruits, and sometimes beautifully carved wooden tools. Each offering was placed carefully, a quiet message of friendship and respect. John was touched. He realized that the warriors and the woman had returned in their own way, not with force, but with trust and acknowledgement. He understood that this was the beginning of a relationship built on honor rather than fear. One morning he saw movement on the ridge again. His heart raced, expecting the return of the warriors. But this time, there was no threat in their presence. The towering woman appeared first, followed by a small group of warriors. They moved deliberately, not with the tension of confrontation, but with calm and grace. John approached them cautiously, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. The woman gestured for him to follow, and he did, stepping lightly over the rocky terrain toward a shaded area where she had gathered a few of her people. There was no need for words at first. They communicated through gestures, sharing the language of respect that had begun the day of the encounter. John realized that these people were willing to teach him, to include him in their traditions, and to build a bridge between their world and his. The towering woman showed him how to identify edible plants in the desert, how to conserve water in ways he had never considered, and how to observe the land with patience and understanding. Each lesson was given with care, and John absorbed them eagerly, feeling both gratitude and admiration for their wisdom. Over time, the warriors joined in small ways. They demonstrated traditional skills: how to make tools, track animals, and navigate the desert terrain. John learned quickly, not because he was naturally gifted, but because he respected the process and listened with humility. In return, he shared knowledge from his life on the ranch, teaching them ways to tend to livestock and repair fences. What began as a cautious relationship of observation and respect grew into mutual trust and cooperation. The desert, once a place of isolation, had become a space for learning, friendship, and growth. John reflected on the incredible turn of events. Only a few days ago he had faced the overwhelming presence of 300 warriors, unsure if he would survive. Now he worked alongside them, learning their ways and sharing his own. He understood that his actions, small gestures of kindness, had set the foundation for something far greater than he could have imagined. The towering woman had been the key, recognizing his courage and guiding her people to trust him. And through patience, honesty, and respect, John had earned a place in a world that had once seemed completely foreign. Life on the ranch continued, but it was richer now. The land, the animals, and the people he had come to know were intertwined in a way that gave meaning to each day. John found joy in the simple moments: sharing a meal with the warriors, observing the sunset with the towering woman, or quietly tending to the cattle while reflecting on the lessons he had learned. Each day was a reminder that compassion, courage, and understanding could transform not only situations, but also lives. The towering woman often visited alone, sometimes bringing small gifts or tokens, sometimes simply observing John's work. Over time, he grew to understand her better, not only her strength, but her wisdom, patience, and deep respect for life. He realized that she had been a guide in every sense, protector, teacher, and friend. Through her, John learned that true leadership was not about domination, but about respect, guidance, and trust. The relationship between John and the warriors also deepened. They began to help him with tasks that had once seemed daunting alone, repairing fences, moving heavy materials, and caring for the cattle during particularly hot days. John, in turn, shared the knowledge he had gained over years of ranching. The exchange of skills created bonds that transcended culture and language. It was a reminder that shared goals and mutual respect could unite even the most different of people. One evening, as the sun set in brilliant reds and oranges, John sat with the towering woman on a small hill overlooking the ranch. They watched the desert stretch endlessly before them. The warriors were below, tending to chores and laughing quietly among themselves. John felt a profound sense of peace. The fear and tension of the first encounter seemed like a distant memory. What remained was a bond forged through trust, understanding, and shared respect. John reflected on what he had learned from this experience. Courage was not measured by strength or size, but by the choices one made in the face of uncertainty. Compassion could ripple outward in ways that were invisible at first, but powerful in their consequences. Respect and honesty could open doors that force and fear never could. And sometimes, the smallest act, a cup of water, a bit of food, a kind gesture, could create a chain of events that changed a life forever. As the night fell and stars twinkled above, John felt grateful. He was no longer alone on his ranch, no longer isolated in the desert. He had friends, teachers, and allies in people who, days before, might have seemed unreachable or even threatening. The towering woman had taught him that the heart and mind were as important as hands and strength, and that the desert held lessons for those willing to learn. Over the weeks and months, the bond between John and the tribe grew even stronger. He learned more about their culture, their values, and their way of life. In turn, he shared his own knowledge and experiences, finding joy in mutual learning and understanding. The desert had transformed from a place of solitude to a place of connection, growth, and community. John had come to see that the extraordinary events of that first encounter were not just an anomaly. They were the beginning of a new chapter in his life. And so, life continued on the ranch, richer and fuller than John had ever imagined. He rose each morning with gratitude for the lessons he had learned, the friends he had made, and the understanding he had gained. The towering woman remained a figure of guidance and wisdom, a reminder of the extraordinary power of compassion and respect. The warriors had become allies and friends, their presence a testament to the strength of trust and the bonds that could be forged through kindness. John often reflected on the simple act that had begun it all, offering water to a woman in need. He realized that even in a harsh and unpredictable world, choices made from the heart could shape destiny in ways no one could foresee. His life on the ranch had been forever changed, not by force or luck, but by courage, compassion, and the willingness to act with honesty and respect. The desert had tested him, and he had passed, not through strength alone, but through the quiet power of human kindness. In the end, John knew that he had found something rare and precious, a connection between people, a respect that crossed boundaries, and a reminder that one good deed could transform not only a day, but a life, a community, and perhaps even a world. The towering woman, the warriors, and the desert itself had shown him that extraordinary lessons could emerge from simple acts, and that the choices made in courage and kindness could leave a mark far beyond imagination.